So for my digital presentation, I'll be talking about societal fears and how they shape sci-fi film uh, through the two examples of the 1956 film Invasion of the Body Snatchers to the remake of the same name from 1978. And I'll explain how societal fears can shape the way we tell science fiction stories. H.G. Wells basically kicks off the genre of invasion media, and something that's interesting about this is how H.G. Wells is an Englishman writing about how a colonial force was coming to invade Britain, which is very interesting and nuanced reversal of how the UK is going around subjugating these other nations with colonialism. So just to help clarify, I have four other science fiction films here that are kind of emblematic about societal fears. I'll just gloss over them real quick. A lot of these are political commentaries. There's very obvious political stand-ins of characters. There's themes that are over the top, but could one day be true. And that kind of explains how science fiction is obviously a satirization of reality, but also kind of a warning, uh, a cautionary tale to society. It's through these things that we can see what people really are fearing and thinking about at these times. Just something quick I'd like to gloss over. I find it really interesting, and I think it's important to discussion about these films. Um, so this is the original novel that the 1956 film is based on, but what I see in a pattern here is the film adapts the novel, and then the 1978 film basically adapts the 1956 film. It's not that much of like a difference between other adaptations, but I think it's important in how the themes work. Like the 1978 is very derivative of the 1956 film. The main character from the 1956 film shows up in the 1978 film as kind of like a cameo or a nod to it. So I think that's something important to take in consideration. So the first film I'll be focusing on is the 1956 film Invasion of the Body Snatchers. The plot of this film is basically this guy is a doctor who knows everyone in the town. He's a very successful doctor, and he starts getting these patients that are like, oh, my parent is not actually my parent, my uncle is not actually my uncle. They've been replaced or something. I can just tell. And so basically, as time goes on, he starts realizing that this is actually happening and it's not some mass hysteria incident. And the whole film is told in a flashback. He's basically being held in captivity by police officers, and they're just like, "What the hell? This can't be real. This is not happening." But then at the end, they're convinced that it's real, and they, quarantine the city, and everything seems to be fine. Some key details I'd like to go over. It's This film is set in Santa Mira, which is actually not a real place, but it is very stereotypical American suburbs from the 50s. You know, the protagonist being a successful doctor who knows every person in town. That's very important because he basically already knows a lot of the characters, and he can see how they change, when they get turned into pod people. Uh, it actually ends on a positive note. Like I said, the authorities are convinced that this man is telling the truth, and they quarantine the town. One thing that's very important is that the studio actually mandated that this is an anti-communist message. There's a speech when uh, the main characters are in the doctor's office being cornered. They're like, we'll never fall for collectivism. We're individuals. So basically, the directors of this film intended it to be this anti-McCarthyism message. They're basically saying, communists aren't these like, aliens from outer space that are emotionless and hive-minded. That's just kind of how a lot of people see them. But the studio actually mandated this anti-communist message, so you kind of have these two clashing ideals going at it. So this film's themes are McCarthyism and communism, basically. I mean, the whole thing is basically a satire of, how an American scared of communism might see communists coming into their, town, converting everyone into emotionless, hive-minded individuals. So this is obviously a big take on McCarthyism and, the fear of the communist invader. But what's also important to know is that, as mentioned before, the studio mandated the anti-communist message, so there's kind of a clash between, what the studio wanted and what the directors and writers wanted. So next, I'll be talking about the 1978 film of the same name, directed by Philip Kaufman. This film basically has almost the same plot, except it's set in San Francisco. There's different characters, such as the main character. He works for the Department of Health instead of being an individual doctor. And it has that famous pessimistic ending where the main character is turned into a pod person. So some key details is that this is set in San Francisco, which is obviously a real city. Some of the characters are ex-hippies or ex-military people. Jeff Goldblum's character is obviously a veteran, and this is a much more obvious dig at McCarthyism and anti-communist sentiment, as the studio didn't have this mandate of an anti-communist message then. And the ending is also very different from the original film. There's that famous scene where the world has basically been taken over by pod people. We don't know it, but then we go up to the main character who seems like he's, unaffected, and he goes, "Oh!" So Philip Kaufman is very important to consider when looking into the themes of this film, as he was a counterculture activist in the past before he started directing films. And he's a very unique auteur. His themes are very much his own, and they relate to his ideas and his views. So some things that influenced this film's themes were Vietnam, the Nixon administration, which were not present during the 56 film. And there's still this push on anti-communism. There's the Vietnam War going on, which is against a communist nation. And there's more of this conformity culture. This American identity starts to become this more, centralized thing as to before. So the reason that these two films are very different is because the political climate at the time that they were made. McCarthyism in 1978 had become much more of a, thing of the past. It was still, pushed with the Nixon administration during the Vietnam War, but it certainly wasn't as present as it was before, and it can now be openly criticized. Also, the lessening of studio control over the messaging of, films that were made was very important as well, because it allowed the director to give this very interesting twist on the original film. So that's the end of my presentation. Here's my secondary sources, and here are my primary sources, the artifacts. Thank you for watching.